Hello and welcome to this session. The purpose of this audiovisual session is to follow on from the topic that we started talking about last week, which is exploring the psychological perspective on gender and how that applies to education. Now, in last week's session, what we looked at were some of the elements of the sort of psychological concept of gender. So we, for example, encountered the idea that from a psychological perspective, your gender identity is a combination of your biological sex, but also the gender role that exists for your gender and the other gender in society, and also your own gender schemas, the concepts you carry in your own head of what the different genders are and what they're like. Now, what we looked at in that case was then just a few general examples of the application of gender to education, but a topic we didn't consider at that time was how your gender identity emerges and develops over time. We talked a little bit about it when we talked about how your gender schemas develop, but we didn't really talk about how it happens, just that it does happen. And one of the questions we never asked is, well, where do you learn about your gender norms? What are the forces that might shape the development of your gender schemas? And that's something we're going to look at very much in this session. Now, one of the major forces that we're going to consider when we're considering the way you learn gender norms and the way your gender schema develops is essentially the way you are conditioned. So we're going back to behaviorism and learning theory and considering how the behavior of those around you, both in the way they treat you and your observation of their behavior, can teach you lessons about how both genders are supposed to behave, both your gender and the opposite gender. And we have to remember that many of the people who are teaching us these lessons, they can be formal lessons we're taught in school, but often they are lessons that people teach us without realising they're doing it, just through the presents they buy us or the stories they read us or the way we see them behave. And so whenever I'm talking about the way you learn gender, don't limit yourself to just thinking about school. Think about learning as something that can go on anywhere and with anyone who sort of teaches you a lesson intentionally or unintentionally about gender. One of the things we're going to look at more particularly is the idea that through these kind of lessons and associations with different activities and different objects to certain genders, that certain activities, certain objects even, can become gendered, and we begin to associate that object or that activity with a particular gender, and that these associations, the way that certain careers, for example, are gendered, can have a major impact in how we develop and the careers we enter into and the jobs and sort of roles that we aspire to long term. What is the first question that almost everybody asks upon hearing that somebody's had a baby? Ask yourself that for a moment. You can pause the recording if you like and think about it, or just what's the first thing that pops into your head? Chances are the first question that most people will ask is it a boy or girl? Now, think about that for a moment. Why is it that they need to know that information so urgently that it's the first question they ask? Well, there's a number of reasons for that. One of the first is language. In our language, although we don't have, English isn't a gendered language in the same way that, say, French is, with every noun having either a masculine or feminine gender, we still use gendered pronouns when we're talking about people. So you talk about him or her. And so we need to know which pronoun we're using when we're referring to the baby. Now, we could refer to it as the baby or it, but people, again, there's social reasons why we don't like to do that, because it sounds unfriendly. It sounds like we're reducing the baby to a mere object, and again, that doesn't sound like you're being very friendly or positive towards the birth of this child. And so, again, social rules and norms expect us to find out the appropriate pronoun and then use it. There are other reasons, though, why we want to know the gender. And that is because it will affect how we interact with the child and how the things we buy it. So, for example, if you hear a friend of yours has a baby and you want to buy some clothes or a little onesie for the child, you may want to think, well, I need to know the gender in order to know what colour onesie is appropriate or what type of present is appropriate. And you have to think about it, the parents begin asking this question about what the gender of the child is before the child is even born, with some parents wanting to know from the earliest possible moment what the gender of the child is. Now again, why this curiosity? Well, because it will shape their behaviour. They may paint the nursery a different colour, for example, And it will shape their expectations. People often feel, well, I have to get ready for a boy or have to get ready for a girl in order to know what to expect, know what sort of, not only what sort of things to buy with them, but what sort of plans to make. And it's ridiculous that we're already making those long-term plans that early on, but in our mind we are. And what this shows is that right from the moment of its birth, a child is bombarded with gender-related messages. The language people use when they talk to it or talk about it, or the presents that are bought, or the colour of the room it sleeps in, all of which will send it gendered messages whether we realise that or not. And it won't just change the things that we do around the child and the objects we get it, but it'll also change how we react to the child. And so parents will often, whether they realise it or not, tend to react more positively when the child engages in gender-appropriate behaviour. So a very dramatic example of this is sort of slightly rougher play or a bit more rough and tumble activities, knocking things over, sometimes breaking things. This will be more acceptable and forgivable if the child is a boy, where we expect that kind of rougher play from boys. And similarly, when people talk about the child and its appearance, they'll be much more likely to praise its appearance if the child is a girl. And essentially, this also sends messages to the child. Now, obviously, when they're too young to understand the language, those messages aren't clear. But as they grow, they learn very quickly the sort of things people say about them. Even if they don't understand the language, they can still understand a parental response, a smile when they do certain things, no smile when they do other things. And those reactions send very strong messages which have a gender component to the child. And so it's from almost the very first moment of its life, it's receiving training, whether it realizes or not, or whether the person who people who are doing it realize it or not. The child is receiving training on how to behave for someone in their gender. And this goes on for such a long time that essentially by a very early age, the child is already conditioned to behave in a certain way. Now, a lot of parents are aware of this and they try to avoid this, but often they don't realize how their language and the way they say talk about characters in stories will still communicate very traditional gendered messages to the child. So it's no mystery to anyone who studies this process that children learn about gender as early as they do, and their gender schemas become very well developed even at a very early age. I want to focus in on one particular aspect of this process, which is the idea that certain gifts, particularly certain toys, are gendered and send gender-related messages. Think back for a moment to your youth. Can you remember any of your favourite toys? Now, a question to ask here is, were those toys gendered in any way? Looking back now with the benefit of hindsight and as a grown-up, can you see now that the toy you loved playing with was a toy that was more associated with your own gender? Or was it gender neutral? Or was it even associated with the opposite gender? Now, whether or not you played with a gender toy that was appropriate for your gender or not is not the point here. The really interesting point I'm trying to get you to think about is, how do you know if a toy was gendered? What is it about the toy that makes you think, yeah, this was a boy's toy, or no, I'd say this was a neutral toy, or no, that was a girl's toy? Can you think about the characteristics of the toy or something about the toy that gives it a gender association in your mind? Well, I think beyond something very obvious like colour, pink for girls and blue for boys, there are likely to be other qualities about the toy which communicated a gendered nature or not. One of the things that tends to communicate a gendered nature is if the toy is associated with certain qualities, certain personal qualities, and those qualities are seen to be more masculine or feminine qualities. So if you think about the toys that are typically associated with boys, they tend to be associated with qualities like strength, power, dominance, technical ability, and these qualities, whether they're in a boy or a man, or anyone actually, are considered to be masculine qualities. Similarly, the toys for girls tend to be associated with caring and nurturing and friendship and appearance, and again, these qualities are often seen as feminine qualities. And so, often what makes something gendered, whether it's a toy or anything else, are the qualities, the personal qualities that object or that activity is associated with. Now, the other thing that tends to make a toy gendered is because we tend to see a lot of people of that gender playing with that toy. So we tend to see more boys playing with this toy than girls. Now, the reason for that is probably because of the qualities I've just mentioned, but that a visual association of seeing a certain toy always being played with by certain genders is another powerful message that sends to you that this is a gendered toy. Because you will find that, let's say we thought, oh, I don't want my kid to be gendered, I want them to play with all toys, I want them to learn about all qualities, not just one gender or another. We could try that, but what you'll typically find is that the child will realise that, hold on a minute, not many of the other boys are wearing this kind of dress or playing with dolls. And similarly, the girls are going to notice that not many other girls are playing with this kind of technical toy or this kind of toy weapon. And so that will also send a message to them that this may be appropriate for you if other people playing with it are the same gender as you, or it may not. And so parents, even parents who want to encourage their children to be more open-minded and play with almost everything, will find that they have to compete with what the child sees around them in their friends. What this means is that gendered toys are just another part of a larger picture of how we learn gender and how we learn what's appropriate for our gender role. Now, I'm not saying there's anything particularly sinister about that, but it is pervasive, it's everywhere. And as we will see in the next slide, it's not just toys and sort of casual activities which become gendered, but very serious lifelong careers become gendered. And they become gendered in much the same way as the toys do, by us associating certain characteristics with those careers, and also by seeing certain people, particularly more one gender than the other, in that role or in that career, and thus associating the career with a particular gender. For the next few slides, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how this idea of something becoming gendered can be applied to more than just toys or stories, but can even be applied to entire roles or careers, which for various reasons have become gendered in people's minds, and so that career or that role is considered to be more appropriate from one gender than the other. Now, in order to explore this issue, we're going to be also exploring one particular study which was done on this issue, which is the Gender-stereotypic images study by Cejka Eagly that you can see mentioned on this slide. This was required reading for this session, and so if you're listening to this recording and you haven't yet read the article, I'd strongly recommend you stop the recording and go and read the article. Now, I always think it's better to read an article with some questions in mind. So for the kind of questions you should be looking to try and answer about the article or within the article, have a look at this slide here to see there's some concepts here which I'm asking you to sort of see if you can figure out what they mean, and the answers to that can be found in the article. And also in the next slide I talk about some of the main findings of the article, and I want you to sort of see if you can locate those findings and figure out what they mean in your own mind. So please do go away and read the article if you haven't done so already, and then come back to this recording. If you've read the article, you'll know that Cejka Eagly were asking a large group of people about their perceptions of certain jobs, who tends to do those jobs, the kind of pay they receive, but also what are the qualities that are required for someone to be good at that job. Now, driving these questions was Cejka Eagly's reading of prior studies and prior sort of concepts which have been put forward, which then inform Cejka Eagly's study. So you need to understand their study, you need to understand some of the concepts that inform their study. Now, I've listed a few of them here on the slide, and my suggestion was that you go away and see if you can figure out these concepts yourself from reading the article. Having done that, I'll see now if I can walk you through my understanding of those concepts, and we'll see how you got on. So one of the first questions I asked you to consider was, based on the prior research that Cejka Eagly had looked at, why is it that people maintain stereotypes? I mean, often we are maintaining a stereotype in the face of examples which contradict it. So why do we cling on to a stereotype and are reluctant to change it or let it go? Well, based on some of the prior research that they found, they identified a number of reasons why we do this. Some of them are personal reasons. So essentially that often we maintain stereotypes because they serve what was Cejka Eagly described as important motivational functions in terms of preserving one's status and justifying one's in-group. Or to put it another way, we do it because the stereotype in some way allows us to justify our own behaviour and see it as valid, even if that behaviour is unfairly biased towards one gender or biased against one gender. Or sometimes we're trying to justify our own sort of unfair advantage. So, for example, if you are a man, it's easier for you to get into leadership positions because people are a lot more willing to accept a man in a leadership position. And so you might cling to the stereotype that, yes, really, it's right that I'm in charge because I'm a man, because men make better bosses. You're effectively sort of justifying your own advantage, even if it's an unfair advantage. And we don't just do this at an individual level, we do this at a societal level, and this is what Cejka Eagly referred to as societal reasons, so that what's sometimes called a system justification, that in a sense we are trying to justify the way the whole of society is set up, which often is done in a way which gives men an advantage in certain areas and women a disadvantage. And because we want to maintain a status quo, we don't generally like to sort of disrupt our social situation. Even if it's not a great situation, we prefer to remain stable than it becoming unstable. Often we will then use gender stereotypes to justify the existing social arrangements and essentially sort of maintain the status quo. So this is one of the reasons that even when stereotypes are pointed out to people, it doesn't always cause or result in the change that you think it might, because people will often cling on to stereotype for either personal reasons or societal reasons. Now, another important issue you need to understand Cejka Eagly's own study is the quote that's said here in the middle. If gender stereotypes justify women's subordination, prestige and income should be associated with occupations being thought to require masculine characteristics. So this is a complex idea, but it's a very important one in terms of their study, and this is one of the reasons I wanted you to think about and see if you could make sense of it. Here, in a sense, is what this idea is saying. This is saying that if gender stereotypes are being used to keep women down, if that is true, then we will associate masculine traits with any job that has power connected to it so as to justify giving those jobs to men and not women. So if the system is kind of biased against women, then what we should find in that system is that any job which has power and wealth associated with it, we'll find that job is typically viewed to require masculine traits, because then that will justify giving those jobs to men and not women, and thus keeping women subordinate without power. Now ask yourself, what are the jobs in our society that have power and wealth associated with them? Often you might think of the CEO of a big company, the prime minister, the head of a school. And if you think of the qualities we often imagine that a CEO or a prime minister or a head teacher should have, they're often qualities which are more easily associated with men than with women. So authority, strength, dominance, aggression. And so in a sense, the system does seem to be set up in a way that is almost designed to justify giving authority and power to men and not women, and thus the effect is to keep women subordinate. So it would seem that there is evidence to support this suggestion that stereotypes function to keep women subordinate, keep them sort of under the control of men. Now there's another concept that's mentioned here, which is an important one, which is called correspondence bias. Now correspondence bias is similar to another concept called fundamental attribution error, and the idea was to see if you could find out what either of them mean. The basic idea about correspondence bias or fundamental attribution error is that people have a tendency to overestimate how much people's behaviour is down to their personality and to underestimate how much their behaviour is down to the situation they're in, their surroundings. So when we see somebody do something, we're more likely to attribute that behaviour to that person's personality and their characteristics rather than the situation they're in. The reason that bias is important is because it then explains the theory mentioned just below it on the slide, social role theory. And what social role theory is saying is that because we regularly see women and men in certain jobs, we assume that they must naturally have personality and attributes or abilities that suit those jobs. So, for example, if we see that most firefighters are men, and since firefighter generally means that you have pretty impressive personal courage in dangerous situations, we assume that men must be braver than women because, look, they're drawn to that job and they're good at that job and that job requires bravery, therefore men must be naturally brave. This theory is very much in line with fundamental attribution error because we assume that the bravery of these firefighters is down to their personality, something they brought with them to the job, rather than the fact that they've signed up for a role which requires them to be brave. So it's their personality, not their situation, that we use to explain the job, or the fact that it's all men who are doing it and that we explain their bravery. So what this means is that if we see a particular job is dominated by a particular sex, we are likely to believe that the qualities that are required in that job are qualities that that sex naturally has, and thus that's why they're drawn to the job and that's why they're good at the job, that they sort of brought those qualities to the job with them rather than these were qualities they learned on the job. And as we'll see in a minute, this can apply to jobs within education as well, where the majority of people are women. Now that we've looked at some of the concepts we'll need to understand the Cejka and Eagly study and what it found, let's look at the study itself. What Cejka and Eagly did was, firstly, they got a list of personal attributes, ways of describing people, 56 of those, and they got one group of participants to decide how much each of the different attributes was a masculine one or a feminine one. And based on this pre-test review, they were able to classify all the 56 attributes as either masculine or feminine based on what the majority of people thought. Then they got a completely new group of people who hadn't been involved in rating the different attributes, and instead they got those people to use those same attributes but instead link them to particular jobs. They showed those people 10 different jobs and they asked them, for each one of these jobs, tell me how much you think each of these 56 attributes is something important in that job, is something that someone who does that job would need to have, a quality that that person would need to have to be successful in that job. And as well as doing that, they also asked those same people to rate each job based on how much prestige they thought was attached to it, and how much people get paid for that job, and also what percentage of people currently doing that job are men and what percentage are women. Now, to find out then what they found, if you had a go at the article and you were finding it difficult to find the findings of the article, one thing I recommend is that you can skip over the results section, which often tends to give you the results in a very technical manner, and instead start in the discussion section, which starts on page 419. Now, it's hard to spot because the title of the discussion section is appears at the very bottom of the left-hand column, but that means the discussion starts at the top of the right-hand column. Discussion is often better because there's less stats jargon than the results section, and it's easier to understand. And you'll also find that most of the key findings are on that very first page of the discussion, which again is pretty typical. Discussions tend to lead with the big findings, the most important ones. So what are the findings? Well, you can see here on the slide the major findings. Firstly, people believe that someone in a female-dominated job requires female traits to be successful, and in a male-dominated job, they believe that the person to be successful in the job required male-dominated traits. And this is exactly what was being mentioned in the previous slide when we talked about the social role theory, that effectively, because people see mostly men in a job, they assume that the job requires masculine characteristics to be successful. Now, the other thing that was interesting that Cejka and Eagly found was that personality traits more than sort of mental or physical traits were the ones that people considered to be important, the determinant, what determined who was going to be good at the job. So it wasn't that men were thought to be stronger or smarter, or that women were thought to be smarter. It was all down to different personality traits such as kindness, bravery, and not physical or mental abilities that people thought mattered when it determines who's good at a job. And the last major finding was that people overestimated how much female-dominated jobs were paid and underestimated how much male-dominated jobs were paid. So they almost were trying to imagine the world as it should be rather than as it really is. And in a sense, they were kind of a little bit blind to the fact that the system favours men because the jobs that men are considered to be more suitable to do are also the jobs which have more power and more wealth and more prestige associated with them. So effectively, Cejka and Eagly's finding pretty much strongly supports the idea that there is a definite bias within the system which favours men and gives men an opportunity to achieve more power and prestige through the jobs and roles that they are considered to be good at doing. We can apply the findings of the Cejka and Eagly study to any number of different professions in order to understand both why certain professions tend to be dominated by one gender more than the other, and also why often the qualities that are thought to be necessary to be successful in those particular professions that are dominated by one gender than the other also happen to be qualities which are more associated with the dominant gender in that profession. An example which of course is directly relevant to this course is teaching. And not surprisingly, we find that the qualities that are considered to be the qualities that make somebody good for teaching or suited to teaching are also qualities which are associated with the gender that is more dominant in the teaching role, and that is feminine qualities, because it's a female-dominated role. I mean, ask yourself for a moment, what are the qualities that most people consider someone needs to be a good teacher, to be suitable for teaching? And are those qualities gendered? Think about that for a moment. You can pause the recording if you like. The answer here would have to be a pretty qualified yes. Although there are some qualities like intelligence and authority which are more masculine, there are far more feminine qualities such as nurturing, compassionate, caring, good with children, good listener, good communicator, which are very much connected with the teaching role. Now, a lot of people wonder if these are qualities that have become associated with teaching because lots of women have traditionally been in the role of teaching, or is it because these qualities were seen to be necessary that in the role that women were attracted to it? It's likely to be a bit of both, but what Cejka and Eagly showed is that we overestimate the degree to which the qualities of a good teacher are something that come from the individuals who bring them those qualities to the job, and we underestimate how much those qualities can be things that people will develop and essentially adopt while they're in the role. And what this is likely to mean is that the bias in the profession is going to favour women joining the profession rather than men, because women are sort of overestimated in terms of how much they will have those qualities, and men are underestimated in terms of how much they will have those qualities. But also, we overestimate how much somebody needs to have those qualities coming into the job in order to do it well. And we underestimate how much it's possible for someone in the job to learn or just adopt those qualities. And so as a result, all of those biases, both the bias in believing that women will have the qualities or more likely to have the qualities to begin with, and also the bias in believing that you have to have those qualities already coming into the job rather than learning them on the job, is going to make it much harder to attract men to the profession, and is going to perpetuate the cycle where we see more women in the profession, and thus assume that the qualities that you need to be good in the profession are feminine qualities. This may have had an impact on some of you listening to this in terms of your decision to come into education in the first place. You have to ask yourself, what did you think you needed to be, or what did you think were the good qualities that a teacher needed to have? And were those qualities that you thought were strengths of yours, and that's why you thought, yeah, I think I'm suited to teaching? And also, how did other people's reactions shape your behaviour? Did their expectations, your friends and family, of what is needed to be a good teacher lead them to have a more or less positive response when you told them that you were thinking of going into education? Chances are, if you're female, you'll have had a more uniformly positive response from people when you indicated an interest in going into teaching. And men, you're more likely to have had a mixed response, not necessarily everybody being against it, but maybe less enthusiastic, less confident that it was the right choice for you than if you had been female. Now, it's interesting that you see this idea that teachers need to be caring and nurturing and have those other feminine qualities more so in sort of lower levels within the hierarchy of teaching. But if you start considering management positions, then you tend to find it's more common for men to be in management positions, even in teaching. And again, this is because of the bias which exists in our perceptions that a management position needs certain qualities, and those qualities are masculine. Again, assuming that men are more likely to have these qualities innately, which isn't necessarily true. And also the bias in assuming that you need to have those qualities going in to be a good manager rather than them being qualities you can learn on the job. This shows us that there's not necessarily has to be any malice or kind of sexism within the hearts and minds of the people within the system to perpetuate the setup as it is now. Simply our way of understanding what makes somebody good at a job, because it is prone to bias, can perpetuate a system where we have men less likely to be encouraged to enter the profession and women less likely to be thought to be suitable to be leaders within that profession. So what have we learned here? Well, a few key sort of takeaway messages that you should be hopefully taking on board having listened to this presentation. One of the first ones is the idea that things, objects, games, toys, stories, roles, careers can all become gendered. And what that means is essentially that in our minds we associate those things or those roles or those careers more with one gender than the other, and we think of them as being more suited to that gender, typically because we connect them with characteristics that themselves are gendered. And so if a thing is connected with feminine characteristics, we think of it as more suitable for women. If a thing is connected to masculine characteristics, we think of it as more suited to men. Now, this can have an effect on sort of less significant issues like what toys we buy, but it can also have an effect on major issues such as which career you sign up for, what subject you study at university, where you imagine yourself to be in the next 10 years. And in that line, we looked at Cejka Eagly study and found that based on our tendency to look at which gender is more dominant in a particular career, that there are more members of that gender in that career, we tend to then be biased in our assessment of what characteristics you need to have to be good in that career. And this leads us to assume that a career that has mostly men in it requires male characteristics, and therefore it's right that it's mostly men and that it's the qualities they brought into the job which made them good at it. And this can apply to lots of careers. It particularly applies to teaching, which is a career that is female dominated. Again, we overestimate how much certain feminine characteristics are necessary to be good at the job, and we also overestimate how much those are characteristics that the women who came into the job had, rather than something that a woman or a man could learn or just simply adopt on the job. Now, another important thing to think of here is that what we're describing here is a systemic bias. We're not describing sort of people who are mean-spirited or sexist or sort of prejudiced in their personality, but rather that the system itself is set up to lead us to make certain estimations which are distorted. And so when you think of this, think of it as a systemic biases or systemic advantage or disadvantage rather than it being bad people who are doing bad things. That's all for this week's topic. Now, next week we're going to be focusing on a new area. It's connected to the social influence that we've been talking to this week, in that it's another way in which we can influence people's behaviours, but this time it's through changing their attitudes, and we're talking about attitude change and persuasion. In the session, we're going to be looking at certain concepts within attitudes and persuasion. Particularly, we're going to be looking at two theories. One is called the theory of reasoned action, and the other is called the theory of planned behaviour. And essentially, those are theories which explain how our attitudes inform our behaviour. But we're also going to be talking about attitudes relating to assessments and essays. How do we decide what the right thing to do is, and where did those attitudes come from, and do they change? This will be a good opportunity for you to maybe also recap on any previous concepts we've mentioned up to this point in the year. So if there's concepts or theories from previous sessions that you're still struggling with and you can't make sense of, make a note of them, and there hopefully will be an opportunity in next week's seminar for the tutor to sort of take questions and have people sort of put forward things that they want the tutor to explain or go through to help them to understand it. So you've got a chance between now and next week to go back through the notes from the last few weeks, identify anything that you're still feeling uncertain about, and bring that kind of concept along to the session to see if other people are also struggling with it, in which case then the tutor may be able to help you understand it on the spot and help you progress in that area, as well as talking about attitudes. Thanks very much for listening. I hope you found this useful, and if you're in my seminar, I'll look forward to seeing you there next week. If not, I look forward to seeing you in the lecture next week.